There are two things in this world that I absolutely despise: uncontrolled bleeding and sloppy bookkeeping. Right now, I was dealing with the latter, though the former was not entirely out of the question given my current location. My office in the South Ward was a glorified closet that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap gin. But my desk, a heavy oak piece I had scavenged and polished myself, was a sanctuary of order. My Mont Blanc pens, the only remnants of my former life on the East Coast, were aligned parallel to the edge of my keyboard. My white dress shirt was crisp, the cuffs rolled exactly twice to expose my forearms without wrinkling the fabric. I was an Omega in hiding a fallen kingpin, playing the role of a pathetic, number-crunching nobody. To survive in a city ruled by feral alphas, I kept my pheromones buried under 3 layers of scent blockers and antibacterial soap. I did not exist. I was just a ghost pushing spreadsheets. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the keys clicking and clacking in a steady rhythm. The quarterly reports for this low-level loan shark operation were a disaster. The numbers did not match. Millions of dollars were unaccounted for, poorly hidden behind amateurish shell corporations. It made my skin crawl. It was an insult to the art of money laundering. I reached for my red fountain pen, uncapping it to circle a glaring $300,000 discrepancy when the heavy, reinforced door of my office suddenly violently kicked open. The wood splintered, a jagged piece of the frame clattering against the linoleum floor. I did not flinch. I just slowly stopped typing. A meathead walked in. He was built like a cinder block and reeked of stale beer, wet dog, and the unmistakable spoiled copper scent of fresh blood. He was an alpha low-level muscle, radiating a wave of aggressive, suffocating pheromones designed to make Omegas drop to their knees and bare their throats. I just felt annoyed. He was tracking mud onto the floor I had swept 20 minutes ago. He marched straight to my desk, breathing heavily. Without a word, he slammed a massive serrated hunting knife down onto the oak. A sharp sound echoed as the blade sank deep into the wood, pinning a crumpled, blood-soaked piece of paper right in the middle of my perfectly aligned workstation. I stared at the knife. It had ruined the varnish. "Boss says you need to zero out the Russi account." The thug grunted, his voice a gravelly bark. "He paid up. In full." I did not look at his face. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes dropping to the piece of paper pinned beneath the blade. It was a collection receipt. The bottom right corner was stained with a thick, dark smear of arterial blood. But that was not what made my breath catch. That was not what made a cold, cancerous irritation bloom in the pit of my stomach. It was the handwriting. Scrawled across the top of the receipt in thick black marker were the words "Notice of Extortion." Extortion. He had spelled extortion with an S. The thug leaned over the desk, invading my space, deliberately blowing a cloud of cheap cigarette smoke into my face. "You deaf number boy," I said, "process the damn paper." I did not let him finish. The OCD I had spent months wrestling into submission violently snapped its leash. Before my rational mind could remind me that I was supposed to be a fragile, terrified accountant, my hand moved. I grabbed my red Mont Blanc pen. I did not pull the knife out of the wood. Instead, with a sharp, aggressive flick of my wrist, I dragged the nib of the pen hard across the paper, crossing out the misspelled word with a thick, violent slash of crimson ink. A harsh scratching sound filled the room. I did not stop at the paper. I let the momentum carry my hand upward, the sharp iridium tip of the expensive pen slicing a clean, stinging line right across the thug's cheek. Red ink mixed instantly with a thin line of his blood. The thug froze. The sheer audacity of the act short-circuited his brain for a fraction of a second. He touched his cheek, his fingers coming away stained with red ink and crimson. "You spelled it wrong," I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection. It was a flat, clinical observation that echoed the deadliness I used to wield back east. His eyes bulged in pure terror and rage. He roared, his hand dropping to the heavy Glock strapped to his waistband. He never cleared the holster. A shadow moved in the doorway. A deafening gunshot cracked from the hallway. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. The thug's eyes rolled backward, and he collapsed onto the linoleum with a heavy, meaty thud. A bullet perfectly lodged in the base of his skull. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air, warring with the stench of copper. But cutting through it all, sharp and overwhelming, was a scent that made my spine go rigid. Bitter black coffee and dry cedar. I slowly looked up. Declan Gallagher stepped out of the dimly lit hallway and into my office. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than this entire building. He was the apex predator of this city's underworld, a kingpin known for his ruthless pragmatism and a body count that defied logic. He did not look at the dead man bleeding out on my floor. His dark, calculating eyes were fixed entirely on me. Declan walked up to my desk. He reached out with a gloved hand and effortlessly yanked the hunting knife out of the oak. He picked up the bloody receipt, his eyes scanning the violent red slash across the misspelled word. For a terrifying moment, the room was completely silent. Then Declan Gallagher chuckled. It was a low, vibrating sound that rattled deep in his chest. He tossed the paper back onto the desk and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick banded stack of $100 bills and dropped it right next to my ruined Mont Blanc pen. "You're wasting your talents in the South Ward," Declan said, his voice a low rumble that carried the absolute weight of a command. "My ledgers are a mess. You're coming to work for me." I looked at the stack of cash. I looked at the blood on my desk. And then I looked into the eyes of the man who currently ruled the empire I secretly planned to steal. I calmly placed my pen back exactly parallel to the keyboard. "I charge double for hazard pay, Mr. Gallagher," I said. Declan smiled. "Done." Gallagher's headquarters was a fortress masquerading as a high-end logistics firm in the heart of Manhattan. The upper floors smelled of expensive espresso and corporate deception, while the subterranean levels reeked of diesel-stale sweat and the unmistakable metallic tang of freshly cleaned firearms. My new office was on the 42nd floor. It was a glass-walled enclosure that offered a panoramic view of the city I used to own. My desk was a sprawling slab of black marble entirely free of clutter. I had explicitly requested a vintage mechanical keyboard. In a building filled with feral alphas and the constant muffled cracks from the basement firing range, I needed an anchor. I typed steadily, the rhythmic sound of the heavy keys acting as a metronome for my sanity. I was currently untangling a web of offshore accounts that Declan's previous accountant had butchered. It was child's play, but I made sure to hunch my shoulders, shrinking into my oversized gray cashmere sweater. I was playing the part, the fragile, unregistered Omega pulled from the gutter, terrified of his own shadow. I heard the heavy, dragging footsteps before the glass door even opened. A massive enforcer named Tommy strode in. He smelled like cheap aftershave, burnt cordite, and street grit. He tossed a leather-bound ledger onto my pristine marble desk. "Boss wants the waterfront numbers crunched by noon," Tommy grunted, crossing his massive arms. I stared at the ledger. More specifically, I stared at the smudged, dark brown thumbprint staining the bottom corner of the leather cover. Dried blood. My chest tightened. The OCD I kept on a choke chain flared a hot spike of irrational rage, piercing my prefrontal cortex. I did not say a word. I slowly opened my desk drawer, pulled out a bottle of 70% isopropyl alcohol and a microfiber cloth. I sprayed the ledger several times with the alcohol. Then I meticulously wiped the blood away my face, a mask of carefully constructed Omega anxiety. I tossed the cloth into the biohazard bin I had installed yesterday, then pumped exactly 3 squirts of antibacterial hand sanitizer into my palms. Tommy stared at me, his jaw slackening. "Are you out of your mind, kid?" I kept my eyes down, rubbing the sanitizer into my skin, forcing my pheromones to spike with a sweet, nauseating wave of synthetic vanilla and raw panic. "I have a weak immune system," I stammered, making my voice waver perfectly. "Biohazards." Through the glass wall of my office, I could see Declan Gallagher's private suite. He was standing by the window, a phone pressed to his ear, but his dark, heavy gaze was locked entirely on me. Even through 50 feet of reinforced glass, the weight of his attention felt like a physical pressure. He did not look away. He just watched me clean my hands for the 3rd time. The next morning, the dynamic in the office shifted. Tommy walked in to deliver the morning manifest. This time, he did not smell like cordite and blood. He smelled aggressively of generic floral soap. He held the paperwork out with 2 fingers, looking utterly humiliated. "Do not," Tommy warned as I reached for my sanitizer. "The boss sent out a memo. Anyone entering the financial glasshouse has to scrub up first. You got guys out there who crush skulls for a living, washing their hands like prep school girls." I blinked, genuinely surprised. I looked up at Declan's office. The Alpha Kingpin was sitting at his desk, reading a dossier. He did not look up, but the faint, amused curve of his mouth was unmistakable. I went back to typing on my keyboard. By 3 in the afternoon, the artificial peace shattered. I was walking across the massive marble lobby of the 42nd floor, carrying a stack of reconciled files, when the elevator doors chimed and violently slid open. 3 men stepped out. They were not Gallagher's men. They wore the colors of the Maroni Syndicate, an older decaying faction that had been contesting the waterfront. They were shouting, guns already drawn, demanding to see Declan. The lobby erupted. A deafening roar of gunfire shattered the pristine silence. Marble chipped and flew through the air like shrapnel. Gallagher's security details returned fire instantly. Time slowed down to a glacial crawl in my mind. The kinetic awareness of a former syndicate boss took over. I calculated the trajectory of the shooters. The man on the left was sweeping his Glock in an arc that would cross my chest in exactly 1.2 seconds. Muscle memory screamed at me to drop my center of gravity, draw the ceramic blade strapped to my ankle, and sever his Achilles tendon before using his body as a meat shield. But I was Nolan the accountant, Nolan the Omega. If I moved like a predator, I was dead. Declan would kill me himself. So with a fraction of a second to spare, I artificially snapped my ankle to the side and threw myself off balance. I let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp, dropping the files, and artificially stumbled directly out of the bullet's path. The round shattered the glass partition exactly where my head had been a microsecond prior. I braced for the hard, agonizing impact of the marble floor. It never came. A massive hand clamped around my waist. The sheer force of the grip arrested my fall, yanking me backward into a solid, unyielding chest. Suddenly, the acrid stench of gunpowder and the coppery smell of blood were completely drowned out. My senses were hijacked by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of bitter black coffee and dry cedar. Declan. He had cleared the distance from his office in a blink. He was holding me against him, one arm locked like a vice around my waist, his other hand raising a heavy, suppressed tactical pistol. Two impossibly precise muffled shots rang out. The Maroni shooter's head snapped back, and he folded onto the floor, dead before he realized what hit him. The lobby plunged into a ringing, breathless silence. I was panting, my heart hammering against my ribs. I flooded the space between us with terrified vanilla pheromones, trembling exactly as a civilian should. But as Declan slowly lowered his weapon, he did not let me go. His grip on my waist tightened slightly. He was not looking at the dead men bleeding on his expensive marble floor. He looked down at me. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and far too perceptive. "You're very lucky, Mr. Hayes," Declan murmured, his deep voice vibrating right through my spine. "Most people trip into the line of fire when they panic. You managed to trip perfectly out of it." I looked up at him, my vanilla scent warring with his suffocating cedar. "I've always been good with angles, Mr. Gallagher," I whispered. Declan's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not believe me. Not for a second. The heavy rubber stamp slammed down on the stack of invoices, leaving a glaring red canceled in its wake. It was a deeply satisfying sound. It was the sound of financial hemorrhage. I had been at Gallagher's headquarters for 3 weeks, and in that time, I had turned his chaotic ledgers into a masterpiece of illicit accounting. The men in the basement used hollow point bullets to defend our territory. I used macro-enabled Excel spreadsheets and shell corporations. My kill count was arguably higher. The Maroni Syndicate had tried to retaliate after the lobby shootout, stepping up their extortion rackets on the East End docks. Declan's enforcers were ready to turn the piers into a war zone. I told Tommy to stand down. Instead, I spent 48 hours tracing Maroni's money laundering fronts through a web of bogus offshore logistics companies. Then, with a few keystrokes and strategically placed anonymous tips to the IRS, I froze their primary accounts. I did not need a Glock to bleed a man dry. I just needed his routing numbers. I continued typing the mechanical keyboard, singing its familiar lullaby. It was 2 a.m. The 42nd floor was completely deserted, the glass walls reflecting the sprawling, neon-soaked grid of the city below. The only light in my office came from the glow of my dual monitors. I reached for my mug, only to find it empty. Before my irritation could spike, a large, calloused hand entered my peripheral vision. A steaming mug of black coffee was set gently onto my pristine marble desk, exactly 2 inches from the edge, perfectly aligned with my keyboard. The scent hit me instantly. Bitter espresso dark chocolate and the heavy, intoxicating musk of dry cedar. I did not flinch. I just stopped typing. Declan pulled up a chair and sat across from me. He had discarded his suit jacket hours ago. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing the faded, jagged scars on his forearms. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes resembling bruises, but his posture remained impeccably dominant. "Maroni's men walked off the docks tonight," Declan said. His deep voice barely broke a whisper in the quiet office, yet it commanded the entire room. "Turns out mercenaries do not like getting paid in bounced checks." I kept my eyes on the screen, adjusting a column of numbers. An unfortunate liquidity crisis. They really should hire a better CFO. Declan chuckled. It was a dark, rumbling sound that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. You paralyzed a 50-year-old crime family from a swivel chair, Nolan. I merely corrected some glaring inefficiencies, Mr. Gallagher, I replied smoothly, finally turning to look at him. As an Omega, I find violence deeply upsetting. I prefer the quiet safety of data entry. Declan's dark eyes locked onto mine. The amusement in his gaze was sharp, dissecting my lie with surgical precision. But he did not push. He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip from his own glass of scotch. You know, Declan murmured, looking out at the city lights, most men in this business think power is how hard you can hit. They are fools. Power is logistics. Power is payroll. You can have an army of wolves, but if you cannot feed them, they will eventually eat you. I paused. I looked at the apex predator sitting across from me. This was the man who had ordered half the city burned to secure his throne. The streets painted him as a ruthless butcher, but sitting here in the quiet dark, listening to him speak, I recognized the truth. Declan Gallagher was not a thug. He was an architect. He was a CEO running a multi-million-dollar corporation that just happened to deal in blood instead of stocks. He thought exactly like I did. A dangerous, unbidden warmth bloomed in my chest. I quickly suppressed it, grabbing my red fountain pen and uncapping it to distract myself. Your previous accountant was skimming off the top of the import manifests, I noted, changing the subject with clinical detachment. I routed the lost capital back into your primary holding account. Keep it, Declan said offhandedly. I blinked. It's nearly $400,000. Consider it a bonus for keeping the blood off my marble floors, Declan replied. He stood up the chair, scraping softly against the floor. Go to sleep, Nolan. The numbers will be there tomorrow. He walked out of my office, leaving behind an overwhelming cloud of cedar and silence. I tried to keep working. I truly did. But the adrenaline that had fueled my 48-hour audit was rapidly crashing. The numbers on the screen began to blur. My eyelids felt like they were lined with lead. I told myself I would just rest my eyes for 5 minutes. I crossed my arms over the desk, burying my face in the soft cashmere of my sleeves. Just 5 minutes. I do not know how much time passed. I drifted in a heavy, dreamless void. But slowly my subconscious registered a shift in the environment. The ambient chill of the air-conditioned office vanished, replaced by a suffocating heavy warmth. I was an Omega. My biology was hardwired to detect threats while vulnerable, but my instincts did not sound an alarm. Instead, they purred. I slowly forced my eyes open. The office was still dark, but I was not cold anymore. Something heavy and expensive was draped over my shoulders. I touched the fabric. It was thick charcoal wool, a bespoke trench coat, Declan's coat. I sat up slowly, the heavy wool slipping slightly. My breath caught in my throat. The coat was absolutely saturated with his pheromones. The bitter black coffee and dry cedar were no longer just a lingering scent in the room. They were wrapped around me, clinging to my skin completely, overpowering my own synthetic vanilla scent blockers. To any alpha walking onto this floor, the message would be violently clear. It was a biological neon sign. Mine, do not touch. He had marked me. Without a bite, without a claim, he had wrapped his territory right around my shoulders. I stared down at the dark fabric, my fingers tightening in the wool. The rational, calculating part of my brain, the former kingpin, screamed that this was a fatal compromise. I was supposed to steal his empire, not wear his collar. But as I pulled the lapels of the heavy coat a little tighter around my neck, burying my nose in the scent of cedar, I realized the terrifying truth. I did not want to take it off. I hated the East End docks. The air tasted heavily of salt diesel fuel and rotting kelp. It was a sensory nightmare that clung to my cashmere sweater and ruined the polish on my Oxford shoes. But the quarterly audit required a physical inventory of Pier 4, and I refused to let an entry stand unverified. It was 1 a.m. A thick, freezing fog rolled off the black water, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. I stood beneath the harsh glare of a halogen floodlight, holding a heavy metal clipboard, cross-referencing the serial numbers on a stack of shipping containers. Declan stood a few feet away, leaning against the hood of his black SUV. He was smoking a cigarette, the glowing cherry cutting through the fog. 4 of his heavily armed enforcers formed a loose perimeter in the shadows. He had not needed to come with me to count boxes. He was the head of the syndicate. Yet ever since the night he wrapped his coat around my shoulders, he had become a silent, towering fixture in my immediate orbit. Container 804 is short by 300 pounds, Tommy, I said, marking a sharp red X on my ledger. Check the manifest again. Tommy grunted, stepping toward the container. He never made it. A deafening boom echoed through the night. It was not the pop of a street-level handgun. It was the deafening, echoing boom of a high-caliber sniper rifle. The halogen floodlight directly above me shattered into 1,000 raining shards of glass. Darkness violently swallowed the pier. Contact, Tommy roared, diving behind a forklift. Total chaos erupted. The stuttering roar of automatic weapons tore through the fog as shadows poured out from between the shipping containers. The Moroni Syndicate was entirely decimated. This was a coordinated, highly funded assault. I did not have time to analyze the tactical disadvantage. Before the first piece of shattered glass even hit the concrete, a massive force slammed into me. Declan tackled me hard to the asphalt, shielding my body with his own. He dragged me ruthlessly behind the heavy steel wheels of a semi-trailer. The air was instantly suffocating, filled with the sharp sting of cordite and the overwhelming defensive spike of Declan's cedar pheromones. "Stay down, Nolan," Declan barked, drawing his heavy tactical pistol. His dark eyes were wild with a terrifying protective fury. Bullets pinged and sizzled against the metal, chewing into the side of the trailer, raining sparks and rusted metal down on my pristine white shirt. I crouched in the mud, my hands empty, my breathing artificially shallow. I was supposed to be trembling. I was supposed to flood the air with terrified vanilla. But my lungs froze, my heart skipped a violent, erratic beat. Cutting through the smell of gunpowder and the freezing fog was a scent I had not smelled in 2 years. It was an alpha pheromone, cloying, arrogant smelling of cheap patchouli and gin. Marcus, my former lieutenant, the man who had slaughtered my loyalists back east, stolen my empire, and left me for dead in a burning warehouse. He had not just come to New York to expand his territory. He had tracked me. A cold, cancerous darkness bloomed in my chest. Gallagher, a voice echoed through a megaphone, distorted and arrogant. "You have got something that belongs to me. Hand over the accountant, and I will let you keep the docks." Declan's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against his collar. He did not look at me. He just racked the slide of his pistol. "I do not negotiate with dead men," Declan muttered to himself. He leaned out from the trailer to return fire, but Marcus's men were professionals. A tactical team had already flanked our position, moving silently over the top of the adjacent containers. I saw the shadow drop down from the container just behind Declan. I saw the glint of the suppressed submachine gun raising toward the back of Declan's head. "Declan, right," I shouted, dropping the terrified Omega Act completely. Declan pivoted with terrifying speed, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The shooter fired. The suppressed weapon fired a rapid burst. Declan violently shoved me backward to get me out of the trajectory. He took the burst meant for my chest. 2 rounds sparked harmlessly against his Kevlar vest, but the third caught him high in the right shoulder. Blood, hot, bright, and arterial, sprayed through the air, splattering directly across the crisp white collar of my dress shirt. Declan grunted, collapsing heavily against the trailer tire, his weapon clattering to the wet asphalt. The shooter landed on the ground, chambering a fresh round to finish the syndicate boss. Time stopped. I looked at the blood staining my shirt. It ruined the fabric. It ruined the symmetry. But more importantly, Marcus had brought his filth onto my ledger. He had touched what was currently mine. The fragile, traumatized accountant died right there on the wet concrete. The ghost of the East Coast kingpin woke up. I did not scream. I did not stumble. I dropped my heavy metal clipboard. My hand darted down to the asphalt, my fingers wrapping around the cold, textured grip of Declan's dropped tactical pistol. The weight of it in my palm felt like coming home. I rose from the shadows in a fluid, perfectly balanced, kinetic motion. I bypassed Declan, entirely stepping directly into the line of fire. The shooter's eyes widened, registering the sudden predatory shift in my posture. He tried to swing his barrel toward me. Too slow. I did not aim. I did not need to. Muscle memory took over my arms, snapping up into a flawless weaver stance. I aimed and fired. A clean, clinical headshot. The shooter's skull snapped back, and he dropped like a severed marionette. 2 more of Marcus's assassins rounded the corner of the container, their rifles raised. I did not break my stance. I simply pivoted my upper body with the mechanical precision of a metronome. I fired 2 shots to center mass on the man on the left, then 1 shot to the head of the man on the right. They hit the ground before their brains could even process the muzzle flash. 3 seconds, 4 bullets, 3 bodies. Silence slammed down on Pier 4, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the hot bullet casings on the wet asphalt. I slowly lowered the weapon. My breathing was perfectly even. The cloying scent of synthetic vanilla was entirely gone, burned away by the icy metallic pheromones of a true apex predator. I stepped forward, my ruined Oxford shoe resting carelessly on the chest of the dead assassin. I looked out into the fog, watching the taillights of Marcus's SUV rapidly retreating into the night. He had realized his mistake. I engaged the safety on the pistol with a sharp metallic click. Then I slowly turned around. Declan was sitting against the tire, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He was not looking at the dead men. He was not calling for a medic. His dark, heavy eyes were locked entirely on me. He was staring at the gun in my hand, at the blood on my face, and at the absolute terrifying coldness in my posture. The facade was gone. The vanilla ghost was dead. I stared back at the man who ruled the city. As I was saying, Mr. Gallagher, I murmured my voice, a flat, deadly whisper in the fog. The manifest is short. The ride back to Declan's penthouse was a study in absolute suffocating silence. The sterile elegance of his sanctuary was instantly ruined the moment we stepped through the private elevator doors. Blood dripped from Declan's ruined coat, leaving a jagged dark trail across the pristine white marble floor. I did not play the trembling Omega anymore. I did not hunch my shoulders, and I did not suppress my scent. The synthetic vanilla was gone, replaced by the sharp metallic ozone of an apex predator running high on adrenaline. "Sit," I commanded, pointing to the massive leather armchair under the halo of a modern chandelier. Declan did not argue. He collapsed heavily into the chair, his face a pale, rigid mask of pain. He watched me with dark, unreadable eyes as I bypassed the expensive liquor cabinet and walked straight to the hidden trauma kit secured behind the bookshelf. I returned with a stainless steel tray, forceps, surgical scissors, and a bottle of 90% rubbing alcohol. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, a chaotic collision of Declan's burning cedar raw copper and the stinging clinical bite of iodine. I stood over him, my ruined white shirt clinging to my skin. I did not ask for permission. I took the heavy shears and cut the expensive wool of his suit jacket and shirt away, exposing the ugly, ragged bullet hole high on his right shoulder. "This is going to burn," I stated, my voice completely devoid of the fabricated waver I had used for months. I did not wait for his nod. I poured the alcohol directly into the wound. Declan's entire body went rigid. His massive hands gripped the armrests of the chair, the leather creaking ominously under the pressure. A low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat, the sound vibrating right through my sternum, but he did not try to stop me. I picked up the heavy forceps. My hands were perfectly steady. I had dug bullets out of my own men in damp basements back east. Doing it on a multi-million-dollar rug did not change the mechanics. I probed the torn muscle. Declan's breathing turned ragged, wet, and heavy. "Got it," I murmured. With a sharp, violent twist of my wrist, I pulled. A metallic sound echoed as the deformed, bloody slug dropped onto the stainless steel tray. The metallic sound echoed sharply in the cavernous penthouse. I packed the wound with heavy gauze, securing it tightly with medical tape. Then I stepped back. I dropped the bloody forceps onto the tray and picked up a towel, methodically wiping Marcus's men's blood and Declan's blood from my fingers. The silence stretched. It was heavy, fraught with 1,000 unspoken contradictions. The ruthless kingpin and the lethal accountant, the alpha and the ghost. I tossed the towel onto the glass coffee table. I did not reach for the Glock resting on my hip, but I shifted my weight, balancing perfectly on the balls of my feet. A kinetic readiness. "My name is Nolan Hayes," I said. My voice was a flat, deadly calm that matched the icy ozone rolling off my skin. 2 years ago, I ruled the eastern seaboard. The man who shot you tonight was Marcus, my former lieutenant. He staged a coup, slaughtered my loyalists, and burned my empire to the ground. Declan leaned back in the chair. He reached into his pocket with his uninjured hand, pulled out a crushed cigar, and lit it. The acrid, heavy smoke mingled with the smell of alcohol. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. "I did not come to this city to crunch your numbers." "Declan," I continued, staring him down. "I came to hide, rebuild my capital, and eventually steal your syndicate out from under you so I could buy an army to march back east." I waited for the eruption. I waited for the heavy, suffocating wave of dominant alpha pheromones demanding my execution. I waited for him to draw his weapon. Instead, Declan Gallagher took a slow drag of his cigar, exhaled a thick plume of gray smoke toward the chandelier, and chuckled. It was a dark rumbling sound that rattled deep in his chest. I narrowed my eyes. Are you in shock or simply suicidal? Neither. Declan rasped, a dark, dangerous smile curving his lips. I am just enjoying the view, Nolan. He tapped the ash of his cigar into a crystal tray. Do you honestly think I did not know? I froze. What? You hold your Mont Blanc fountain pen with the exact grip of a man trained in close quarters knife combat. Declan stated quietly, his heavy gaze mapping every inch of my face. You walk across marble floors without displacing the air. You flinch at loud noises perfectly, yet your eyes never fail to track the exits. Declan leaned forward, ignoring the fresh blood blossoming on his bandages. An Omega from the gutter does not know how to launder $3 million through a Cayman Island shell company without leaving a digital footprint. You were a ghost, Nolan, but you were too sharp to be a nobody. A cold spike of genuine shock pierced my chest. You knew I was a liability. You knew I was a former kingpin, and you let me rewrite your entire financial infrastructure. I needed my books balanced. Declan replied, simply the ruthless pragmatism of the alpha returning in full force. Then his voice dropped an octave. It became a low, vibrating command that tugged violently at my biology. And more importantly, I needed you. He stood up. The movement was slow, heavy, and completely undeterred by the massive hole in his shoulder. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides. I did not back away. I tilted my chin up, meeting his predatory gaze head on. He did not ask for permission. He did not offer a gentle touch. Declan's uninjured hand wrapped around the back of my neck, his fingers curling into my hair with a bruising territorial grip. He dragged me forward, crashing his mouth down on mine. It was not a kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of old blood, cheap cigar smoke, and bitter espresso. It was violent, desperate, and possessive. I did not submit to it. I kissed him back with equal ferocity, my hands gripping the lapels of his ruined shirt, anchoring myself to the apex predator who had just taken a bullet for me. Our pheromones warred in the air, the heavy, suffocating cedar wrapping entirely around the icy sharp ozone, melting it down, fusing it into something entirely new and terrifyingly lethal. The facade was dead. The boss and the employee were gone. When Declan finally pulled back, we were both breathless. His dark eyes were burning, completely stripping away any remaining defenses I had. Marcus touched what is mine. Declan growled, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, smearing a faint streak of his own blood across my cheek. I looked up at the man who ruled the city. I felt the cold, familiar weight of the Glock on my hip and the searing heat of his hand on my neck. Then let's balance the ledger, I whispered. Tomorrow we zero out his account. The oversized gray cashmere sweaters were currently turning to ash in the penthouse incinerator. The cheap synthetic vanilla body wash had been mercilessly scrubbed away, swirling down the drain of Declan's massive walk-in shower. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest bedroom, meticulously adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke pitch-black Italian wool suit. It fit like a second skin, a dark, flawless armor I had not worn since the night my Eastern Empire burned. I checked the slide of my suppressed Glock 19, the metallic sound echoing sharply in the quiet room, before slipping it seamlessly into my shoulder holster. I did not smell like fear and submission anymore. I smelled like sharp, freezing ozone, inextricably tangled with the heavy, territorial cedar of Declan Gallagher. We were fused, a biological and tactical nightmare about to be unleashed on the city. Declan stood in the doorway watching me. He was wearing his signature charcoal overcoat, a customized short-barreled assault rifle resting casually against his uninjured shoulder. He did not say a word about my transformation. He did not ask if I was ready. He simply offered that dark, predatory smile that made my pulse jump. Ready to balance the books, Mr. Hayes? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Let's initiate the audit, I replied, my voice perfectly flat. Marcus had barricaded himself in an abandoned meatpacking plant on the western edge of the industrial district. He thought he had built a fortress. He was a fool. Power was not about concrete and steel. It was about logistics, payroll, and blind spots. I had spent 2 years memorizing Marcus's tactical blind spots. We hit the compound at exactly 2 in the morning. We did not bring an army. We brought Tommy and a dozen of Declan's most elite shooters to secure the outer perimeter, but the internal breach was just the 2 of us. It was not a gang war. It was a violent, highly synchronized ballet. Declan kicked the side entrance open, the heavy steel door buckling violently off its rusted hinges. The first two guards inside did not even have time to raise their weapons. Declan's rifle barked, firing multiple rounds, and they dropped into the sawdust. I moved smoothly behind his massive frame, stepping out from his slipstream, only to fire. My movements were purely kinetic muscle memory taking over the spreadsheet logic. I fired 2 suppressed rounds from my Glock that found the chest of a sniper positioned on the catwalk above. He plummeted to the concrete floor with a wet impact. We moved through the rusted corridors in unstoppable meat grinder of calculation and brute force. Declan absorbed the attention, a towering monolith of dominant alpha fury drawing their fire, while I was the ghost in his shadow, surgically removing threats before they could pull their triggers. The air grew rapidly thick with the stench of copper discharged cordite and the suffocating panic of Marcus's dying loyalists. We found him in the central processing floor. Flames were already licking up the wooden support beams Tommy's men had set the southern wing ablaze to cut off any secondary escape routes. The orange glow cast long demonic shadows across the blood-slicked white tiles. Marcus was backed against a rusted conveyor belt, his rifle empty, bleeding heavily from a graze on his cheek. He looked completely feral, reeking of cheap patchouli and sour fear. 3 of his remaining men stood in front of him, raising their weapons in a desperate last stand. Declan did not even slow down. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its tactical sling, and drew his heavy pistol. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, moving forward without breaking his stride. The 3 loyalists hit the ground, their skulls shattered. Declan lowered his weapon. He did not look at Marcus. He simply took a step back, yielding the floor to me. I walked forward. My footsteps were completely silent, my black leather Oxfords avoiding the pools of blood on the tiles with compulsive, OCD-driven precision. I did not draw my gun. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, struggling to reconcile the terrified, trembling accountant he had shot at on the docks with the icy apex predator standing before him now. Nolan Marcus choked out his voice, cracking with terror. "You're working for him. You are a kingpin. You do not bow to Irish street thugs." "I do not bow to anyone, Marcus," I said, my voice a flat, deadly whisper that cut through the roaring crackle of the surrounding fire. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I did not pull out a blade. I pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the very same ledger he had used to track the money he stole from me 2 years ago. I tossed it onto the floor at his feet. It landed with a heavy sound. "Open it," I commanded. Marcus fell to his knees, his hands shaking violently as he scrambled to open the bloody book. I uncapped my red Mont Blanc fountain pen. I stepped directly into his personal space, grabbing him roughly by the collar and jerking him upward so he was forced to look at the pages. "You slaughtered my men," I stated clinically, my eyes dead. "You burned my warehouses. But your greatest offense, Marcus, was that your bookkeeping was absolutely atrocious." I drove the iridium tip of the red pen hard onto the paper right over his poorly written name. With a sharp, violent flick of my wrist, I crossed it out. A sharp scratching sound echoed. "Account closed," I whispered. I dropped the pen, drew my Glock in a blur of motion, and pressed the suppressor directly under his chin. A muffled shot fired, and Marcus collapsed a lifeless heap over the ruined ledger. I exhaled slowly. The tight, cancerous knot of rage that had lived in my chest for 2 years finally dissolved. I engaged the safety and holstered my weapon. The warehouse was fully engulfed now, the heat blistering our skin. Declan stood a few feet away, the firelight catching the sharp, brutal angles of his face. He was watching me with an intensity that made the surrounding flames feel cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy encrypted titanium USB drive. It was the master key, the sole access point to his offshore shell companies, his crypto wallets, and the digital deeds to half the city. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it through the smoke. I caught it effortlessly in my left hand, the metal warm against my palm. I looked up at the syndicate boss, raising an eyebrow. "What is this, Declan?" "That is everything," Declan rasped, walking toward me, completely unbothered by the burning ceiling, raining embers around us. "My capital, my ledgers, my empire." He stopped right in front of me, his massive hands reaching out to grip my hips, pulling my bespoke suit flush against his chest. The smell of cedar wrapped entirely around me, absolute and eternal. "You hold the books," Nolan Declan murmured, leaning down until his lips brushed the shell of my ear. "And from now on, you hold me. Let's go home." The air 1,000 feet above the Manhattan concrete did not smell like diesel fuel, rotting kelp, or stale beer. It smelled of freshly brewed Ethiopian espresso, the cool ozone of a state-of-the-art HVAC system, and the crisp, starchy scent of a tailored Tom Ford suit. It had been exactly 1 year, 2 months, and 14 days since the Marca Syndicate was reduced to ash in the industrial district. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass of my corner office, looking down at the sprawling sunlit grid of the city. I was not wearing an oversized fraying cashmere sweater. I was dressed in a pristine slate gray 3-piece suit. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared. I no longer flooded the room with the sickly, sweet, suffocating scent of synthetic vanilla. I smelled like sharp, freezing winter air permanently intertwined with the heavy territorial musk of dry cedar. The underworld ecosystem had been violently recalibrated, and the resulting evolution was highly profitable. Gallagher Holding Group was now a registered tax-paying conglomerate, occupying the top 3 floors of the newest skyscraper in the financial district. We owned real estate shipping logistics and a chain of luxury hotels. Of course, the hotels were primarily used to launder the cash from the subterranean casinos, and the shipping logistics still occasionally moved unmarked crates of military-grade hardware, but on paper, we were a paragon of corporate American success. I walked back to my sprawling slab of black obsidian that served as a desk and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I reached for my vintage mechanical keyboard, the familiar rhythmic sound grounding me as I woke up my dual curved monitors. The door to my office chimed quietly. It did not splinter open from a thug's boot. It slid open electronically. Tommy walked in. The massive enforcer looked deeply uncomfortable in a navy blue Armani suit, his thick neck straining against the silk tie. He was not carrying a bloody ledger or a suppressed submachine gun. He was holding a sleek silver iPad, with 2 fingers looking at it as if it were a live grenade. "Morning, boss." Tommy grunted, nodding respectfully. He did not smell like cordite anymore. He smelled like expensive aftershave and corporate misery. "Good morning, Tommy," I replied smoothly, adjusting my cuffs. "Please tell me the quarterly reports for the East End docks have been reconciled." Tommy grimaced, carefully placing the iPad onto my pristine desk. "Mostly. The dockmasters submitted the digitized forms like you asked, but there's a discrepancy in the equipment budget for Pier 4. I raised an eyebrow. The tight, familiar coil of my OCD tightened slightly in my chest. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and slowly uncapped my red Mont Blanc fountain pen. I pulled the iPad closer and scanned the digital spreadsheet. My eyes zeroed in on line item 42. "Tommy," I said, my voice dropping to that flat, clinical whisper that still made the massive enforcer subtly shift his weight. "Why is there an expenditure of $350,000 categorized under advanced landscaping equipment?" Tommy cleared his throat, suddenly finding the ceiling tiles very interesting. "Well, you see, Nolan, the boys needed to upgrade the perimeter defense at the southern warehouse. Technically, burying proximity mines in the grass is landscaping." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of the accounting error was almost impressive. "You cannot expense C4 explosives and tripwires as gardening supplies," Tommy, I stated, rubbing my temples. "The IRS does not consider a claymore mine a tax-deductible lawn ornament." "Declan signed off on it," Tommy muttered defensively. "Of course he did," I sighed, picking up my red pen. Before I could drag the iridium tip across the expensive screen of the tablet, the air pressure in the pristine office shifted. A heavy, suffocating wave of bitter black coffee and warm cedar rolled through the open doorway, instantly commanding the space. "Is there a problem with the gardening budget?" Mr. Hayes, a deep, rumbling voice asked. Tommy instantly stepped back, looking incredibly relieved. "I will just go check on the lobby security." He practically bolted from the room, the glass door sliding shut behind him. Declan Gallagher walked toward my desk. The syndicate kingpin, now the CEO of our entirely legitimate empire, looked devastatingly sharp in a black bespoke suit. The brutal, jagged angles of his face were softened by the bright morning sunlight, but his dark eyes remained entirely predatory. He did not sit in the chair across from me. He bypassed the desk entirely, stepping directly into my personal space. I did not flinch. I did not look up from the tablet. "Your men are attempting to launder military ordnance through a landscaping shell company, Declan," I said, my tone laced with dry reprimand. "It is a logistical nightmare and an insult to my spreadsheets." Declan chuckled, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. He stopped right behind my chair. His massive hands reached out, resting heavily on my shoulders. The warmth of his palms bled through the expensive wool of my suit jacket, sending a familiar grounding shiver down my spine. He leaned down, pressing his chest flush against my back, wrapping his arms loosely around my torso. The scent of cedar enveloped me completely, an absolute unyielding declaration of territory that no longer felt like a cage, but a fortress. "They are just keeping the grass cut," Nolan Declan murmured, burying his face in the crook of my neck, his lips brushing the fading invisible line of an old scar. "It is a sloppy categorization," I insisted, though my voice lacked its usual icy bite. I raised my right hand, holding the red Mont Blanc pen. Without turning around, I brought the heavy, expensive pen down directly onto the back of Declan's scarred knuckles. A sharp, distinct tap sounded, a reprimand from a frustrated accountant to a feral alpha. Declan did not pull his hand away. He just laughed again, turning his head to press a warm, lingering kiss against my pulse point. "I will have Tommy recategorize it under pest control." Declan compromised, his breath ghosting over my skin. "Does that balance the books, Mr. CFO?" I looked down at the tablet. I looked at the red pen in my hand. Then I leaned back, resting my head against the solid, unyielding shoulder of the man who had burned down the city to give me a desk. I thought about the damp, miserable closet in the South Ward. I thought about the terrified, vanilla-scented ghost I had pretended to be. I had spent 2 years planning to steal an empire from the shadows, only to realize that the most efficient way to conquer the apex predator was simply to organize his files. I capped the red pen with a sharp, satisfying click. I placed it perfectly parallel to my keyboard. "The books are balanced." "Declan," I whispered, turning my head slightly to capture his mouth in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of espresso and absolute power. "Account closed."